All right, the main goal is to provide pictures for family members who might wish to have them rather than copy a whole bunch of family pictures that have accumulated at my house. I thought I'd put them on a DVD and also do a little oral history informally, tell some stories about these folks. And maybe if someone's interested, they can follow the genealogy someday or look at the papers, whatever they wish to do. The first photo you see is of Nimrod Milton Greene. He was my great-grandfather, and this is the oldest photo we have of a family member. Nimrod was born in 7/31, 1827. He had a brother, Ashton, and a sister, Virginia. And he was born in, near Paris, Virginia. And he was orphaned at age 8. Ashton was 6, and Virginia was 1. So before we follow Nimrod down the road on the story, we're going to back things up a little bit to his parents and take back the Greene line and the Hitt line so that those who are interested in genealogy can follow that. This is the most boring part, so we'll go through it real quickly, and then some of the stories will occur through the other photos that are to follow. Nimrod's parents were John Greene and Elizabeth Hitt, and they both died young. The children were orphaned when they were very young. John was died in 1831 at age 30, so he was born around 1801. Elizabeth Hitt died in 1835, and the children were sent to her brother, who we'll meet a little bit later down the line. As far as the Hitt family is concerned, if you follow the Hitt line backwards, it goes quite far back to about 1714, where the first Hitts arrived. Was Peter Hitt came with with about 12 families of German miners who were brought by Alexander Spotswood. They were sent up on the Rapidan River in Orange County to a place they called Germana, since they came from Germany. They were miners to mine for iron and possibly silver. We have a lot of history on them. There's a Germana society. There's a whole bunch of history on the Hitt family. It goes way, way, way back. As far as I was able to tell recently, John Greene was the lost leader of the Greene family. I have some papers that say he came from England, and that was all it was, and it was a dead end there. But Mary Wiley, who's the daughter of Lillian Norman, who compiled most of the written history we have, has done some added research, and it appears like things go further back than that. So John Greene's father was Charles Greene, who married a Mary Shacklet, and John Greene's grandfather was a Joseph Greene, who was born in 1750 in Kings George County. Had a wife named Lydia. He died in 1815. Joseph's father was Robert Greene, born 1716 in Richmond County, Virginia, and passed. Robert was the furthest back we get is George Greene, who was also from Richmond County and died in 1719. There's a legend of the shilling in the family. Apparently, the first Greene to come over from England apparently was an indentured servant, and he had a shilling in his pocket, and apparently began here as an indentured servant. And in his will, he had a son, perhaps Robert, who he was displeased with, so he gave him the shilling. He'd kept his 1 shilling that he had in his pocket from the very beginning. He gave it to his son. That was his inheritance, which is passed down and passed down and passed down. And Pete Greene has the shilling now in California. So let's go back to the story. We have these 3 children. Nimrod, Ashton, Aldrich Ashton. They used his middle name, Ashton, in Virginia. They were orphaned in 1835, and they came from Paris, Virginia, and were adopted by her brother, who was Dr. Nimrod Milton Hitt, and he lived in the Greeneville area. Moved several times in Greenville, and ultimately to a farm in Lofton, Virginia, known as Mountain View. Little Virginia died when she was a little over 1 year old. The next picture you see is of Auntie, and this is the oldest family picture we have. This is Elizabeth Krogler Hitt, who's the wife of Dr. Nimrod Milton Hitt, and Elizabeth was from Rockingham County, Virginia. And Dr. Hitt goes by the title of doctor. I have found some objects in the Greene desk that would indicate, and I have an OB text with his name in it and whatnot, that he had some medical training. Some say he never practiced. Some say he only farmed. So I'm not really sure about that. He was a very large man, and interestingly, he was a witness to Cyrus Hall McCormick's demonstration of the Reaper, and he was a person who could actually write, and he wrote down and also participated in the legal battles over who truly had invented the Reaper first. There's a book called An Old House in Greenville by Michael Schutte, and there's a whole chapter devoted to Dr. Nimrod Hitt and how he helped out the family of the McCormicks and testified. He also at one time owned this old house in Greenville, which is why he's in there, a coincidence. He also owned Kings Hill in Greenville, Virginia, which is interesting because my grandfather, Eugene Franklin Vines, winds up coming around 50 years later and purchasing Kings Hill, and Kings Hill is still in the family. It's owned by my cousin Stanley Damastis. At any rate, the Dr. Hitt and his wife Elizabeth had no children at the time, and they adopted the 3 children that came from his sister. And after a time, they did have children of their own. So the lady you see there in the photo, they had a child, Orestes, who was born in 1839, and he died shortly thereafter at about 3 months. They also had a child, Caldonia, born in 1858, and Elizabeth at the time was 45 years old when she had Caldonia. And what is sad is Caldonia only lived till she was 7 years of age, and she died very shortly after Dr. Hitt died. And so Auntie, as they called her, stayed there at Mountain View at the time and probably was helped in farming by Nimrod and Ashton. The next photo is Aldridge Ashton Greene. He was born 11/22/1827, and he was 6 years old when he was orphaned with his brother, came to Dr. Hitt's. He was named after his uncle, Aldridge Ashton Hitt, and he became a 49er. He went on the gold rush out to California when that came along. Apparently he went out there with a partner. Apparently they did very well. They got some gold. They were heading back home, and his partner decided his share wasn't enough, so he was poisoned on the way back home and left for dead. He was picked up by some folks who took care of him. After a while, he was able to get word somehow to Dr. Hitt, who wired money, got money to him, and enabled him to come home. He was never well thereafter. He did not fight in the war. He was unable to work the farm. There is some record of him being in Montana in the 1870s, but by 1880 he was back on the farm in Lofton. He never married, nor did he have any children. We're now back to the photo of Nimrod Greene, so I want to tell you about him. He was orphaned at age 8. in 1835, moved in with his uncle near Greeneville, stayed there. And there's a autograph book. I have a photo of it. I don't own it. That talk about his travels. And apparently, when he was about 27 or 28 years old in 1852 to 1854, he went to Kentucky, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas. Took a long road trip down through the South. By 1858, best I can tell, he had moved back to Warrenton, the Warrenton area where he had come from. Perhaps he was staying with relatives of his mother or the Hitt family. At any rate, he became a constable in Warrenton at that time. He also, on the tax records, he has cattle, so he may have been in his possession. He may have done some farming. And in 1858, he was one of the original members of the Black Horse Troop in Warrenton. Actually, they were initially a Virginia militia. You can see the 55 on the top of his hat. It was the 55th Virginia Militia. And when things were stirring up before the Civil War, there were a number of militias and military groups that were getting together. John Brown's raid was in October 16th of 1859, and he was sent to Harper's Ferry. And this photo was taken in Harper's Ferry, and the uniform would be a federal uniform or a Virginia State Militia uniform. It's not a Confederate uniform. They were personal guards of John Brown. There is actually a quote where John Brown is quoted by Nimrod as saying how well the Virginians had treated him and how kindly they were. John Brown had a way with words when you read some of his quotes and writings, but at any rate, apparently Nimrod had some personal contact with them. And then in May of 1861, when they were mustering up for the Civil War, it became the Black Horse Troop, or Company H of the 4th Virginia Cavalry. He made it all the way through the war. He was captured and imprisoned, captured in Warrenton in 1862. He fought under Jeb Stuart, Fitzhugh Lee, did some, the Black Horse did some personal work for Stonewall Jackson, etc. He was finally captured at Five Forks, April 2nd, 1865, taken to prison again. And he was released at the end of the war and came home and farmed probably at the farm of his wife, who we're going to meet in a second, and then ultimately comes back to live at Mountain View. He died of dropsy on 2/21/1882 at the age of 54. He was known as a great hunter. He did a lot of night hunting. He loved to ride. He was a great dancer. He loved to dance, and seems to have been a good man, although not long-lived, probably from the hardships he suffered during the war. His wife was Amanda Virginia Wheatley, whom you see in this next picture. She was born September 25th, 1835. And before we go on with her, just to take the Wheatley family back, the Wheatleys were go back into the early 1700s. They got land through King's Grant. Also in her family were Hitts, of the same lineage of Nimrod, the Hitt family through the Germans at Germanna on the Rapidan River. And actually, there is a connection there, and I believe, the best that I can tell, they may have been second cousins. At any rate, Amanda lived at Laurel Hill, which is the next photo that you see. And Laurel Hill was a large farm with a large house near Rixeyville, Virginia. And she had 2 brothers and 6 sisters. When she was young, she had a governess. She went to a ladies' school in Dumfries, Virginia. She studied art, music, painting. We have a Xerox copy of one of her paintings. She played piano and loved to play the piano. And they were married in February of 1865, of all times. And probably there was very little food for anyone. Nimrod, after the wedding, had to go back to Richmond and Petersburg and the trenches, where he was ultimately captured 2 months later. And after the war, they probably farmed at Laurel Hill, the farm of Laurel Hill. The next picture will show you a more modern photo of Laurel Hill, where the front porch is missing, and we made several trips down there when I was a youngster to look at the big house on the Hazel River. They moved to Lofton, to Mountain View Farm, ultimately, and lived there with Auntie, who was the wife of Dr. Nimrod Hitt and Nimrod's foster mother. The next picture is a porch picture of at Mountain View, and it's not a real quality picture, but I want to let you know who's in the photograph. On the left is Elizabeth, or Aunt Betty. She's on the far left. She was born in 1873, and she married Robert Fravel. So that's of the Fravel line. The person behind Elizabeth is Milton Greene, whom we're going to talk about later. He's apparently pulling her pigtail at the time, and he's very tall. He's only 15 years old. There are only 2 pictures of him. He's my grandfather. The next person is an Albert Finter. We don't know anything about him. In the wheelchair is Auntie. Auntie is Elizabeth B. Krugler Hitt, wife of Dr. Hitt, and that's Auntie, who had been there for so long, who raised Nimrod and Ashton. And then standing in the center at the door is Amanda Virginia Wheatley Greene, the wife of Nimrod, Milton Greene. She's there at Mountain View. Seated beside her is Ashton Greene, who actually outlived his brother, who was in the Civil War. And that is Ashton with the beard, with the boots on. And next to, next to him standing is Sally Lee Greene. Aunt Sally is mentioned. She was born in 1868, and she never married. And then the last person on the right is Aunt Nancy Shelton, of whom I don't know anything and wish I did. But they called her Aunt Nancy. So that's the picture on the porch there. And Amanda Virginia Wheatley and Nimrod Milton Greene had 5 children. The first was Mary Ashton Greene, and she married a Steele, so she became part of the Steele line. Secondly was Sally Lee Greene, who was unmarried. Sally's in the picture. They also had a child, Caldonia Rush Greene, who married a Leitner, who was a neighbor, and Lillian Leitner Norman comes from that line. Also there is Elizabeth Leachman Greene, who was a Fravel, and then Milton E. Greene. And the Elizabeth Leachman Greene became a Fravel, and Martha Grow is descended from that line. And Milton also put an E on our name, so he became the one to put the E on it, apparently, because it doesn't appear before that. A few pictures back, you will notice I didn't address the Black Horse Cavalry, and there is a photo, a Don Prechtel painting of the Black Horse Cavalry. It's entitled Native Sons. When Nimrod Greene was a scout for the Black Horse, and he's a fellow in the hat with the binoculars on the left. Prechtel was a pretty prominent Civil War painter. Okay. Let's go to Milton Greene and talk about him a little bit. You see the photo of Milton. There are only two photos of him, one when he was 15 years old on the porch at Mountain View, and the other of Milton is here probably in Stanton. He was born in Lofton, Virginia in 1876, and he was 5.5 years old when Nimrod died. His father also died young, and he was married in 1902 when he was 25 years old, and he lived until 1942 when he died of pneumonia. Initially, he likely farmed the farm at Mountain View where he was born, or I'm sorry, not where he was born, but where he was raised. He would have possibly been the only capable male, or farmed it with his with Ashton when he was able to farm. And they moved around a great deal as he got older and after he got married. He became a lumber dealer in lumber. He would in early as 1908 when his first appears on business records. He exported lumber. He was sort of a middleman. He would buy lumber from local crews at Lofton and Vesuvius, get the lumber on the railroads and ship them all over up and down the East Coast, particularly a lot in 1912. The lumber business, perhaps with World War I, that began to slow down, and the next evidence we see of him working is he began to be an apple exporter and dealer in the years of the 20s. You can see the next picture here is of his car. He was one of the first people in the county to have a car, and Oakland was his first vehicle. He also had a telephone by 1901. In later years, he was a building contractor. He developed subdivisions. He built homes. Mary Gray Lane is one particular area. He was just quite a trader and a swapper. He owned multiple farms all over. He moved a great deal. He actually had an insurance license to sell insurance also. Milton in 1913 bought a farm in Fairfield, Virginia, which is the farm that's still in the family. We call it the Greene farm, so it's been in the farm now for just about 100 years. Milton married Eliza Jane Trimble, you can see on this picture. Eliza Jane was born March 13th, 1879, and lived until 1922. If you trace her lineage out, the Trimble family and also the Crawford family were Scotch-Irish. The Trimbles were some of the very first folks into Augusta County out towards Swope. The Crawfords go all the way back to Scotland. There's a large text on the Crawfords back through Scotland, an extensive book. They were some of the first folks in the valley at all, with Jost Height when he came into the valley in the northern part. He had them with him, so they were early settlers in this area. Because she died so young, we know little of her. Apparently she was a wonderful lady, grew up in Swope, Virginia, and unfortunately we don't know a whole lot else about her. And they had moved a tremendous amount over the years. Talking to my Aunt Frances, they had moved back and forth numerous different places, and Milton was always moving. There's one story and we think this may be why the Greene farm was never sold by my father. Apparently she was in the home one day and looking down the lane, a guy drove up in a wagon with a plow and began to unload the plow, and Milton Greene always kept his pistol on his desk, and she went and got the pistol, stuck it in her skirt, put her apron over the skirt, walked out the road, and asked the gentleman what he was doing. He said, well, that Milton Greene was going to sell him the farm. They were getting the paperwork done, and Milton said it was okay to go ahead and plow the field, start beginning plowing in the fall for spring planting. And she told him, she didn't pull the gun out, but she told him he could put that plow back on the wagon because this place wasn't for sale. And she refused to leave there. And we often wonder if that's why the farm was kept in the family. There were 6 children born to Eliza and Milton over the years. Frances was born in Swope, Virginia, in 1903. She was the oldest. Sarah was born in Lofton. Also, Mary Bell and Nimrod Greene were born at the Lofton house. I assume this was at Mountain View. My father was born in Spotswood, and Aunt Helen was born in Rafine. So there was quite a lot of movement all the time, back and forth to, my Aunt Frances mentioned they lived in Lofton, then Swope, then back to Lofton, then Spotswood, then Fairfield, then Brookwood, then Mary Gray Lane, and Kensley Court. So they moved around a great deal. Frances said that their parents would gather them around to read stories, sometimes Uncle Remus. She said they went to a private school at the Hunter Place in Fairfield. They had a governess. I don't think there were many public schools at the time, so I think that's probably the reason. They first had a governess at their house in Spotswood, as they lived so far from school. Frances said she didn't go to school until she was 13 years old. They also had an epic journey that my dad and several of them talked about. Apparently Milton was interested in buying up some orange groves in Florida, so around the 1920s they made a big road trip in 2 cars down to Florida, to Ocala over Christmas time, but we know from Christmas cards and Christmas postcards, and apparently nothing came of this. Nothing was purchased at the time, and they returned, but they all talked about it because it was their big trip. The next picture you're going to see is a small photo of the Greene children. Only 4 at the time. The Mary Bell Greene is the one who identified the children in the photo. At the top of the photo is Mary Greene, and on the left is Sarah Greene, who would have been the next oldest. I'm sorry, I got that out of order as far as the age. Mary Greene's at the top, Sarah Greene's on the left. On the right is Frances, and then seated or sitting on the floor in the front is Nimrod Trimble Greene. The next picture you'll see is at the Mary Bell, David Bell wedding in St. Louis. I thought these were good pictures of at a young age of some of the siblings at the wedding. Frances Greene appears in the back center behind Mary Bell. Frances was the oldest. She was born in 1903. She went to college at Mary Baldwin, where she came down with tuberculosis and apparently did not or could not go back to school after that. And so she ultimately finished schooling at Dunsmore Secretarial School in Stanton. She worked for the Presbyterian Church as sort of a church secretary. She never married. She took in elderly ladies and cared for them in her home, as was often done at that time, until she was old enough to move to a retirement home in Bridgewater, Virginia. The next child was Sarah Jane Greene, who was born October 10th, 1904. And as you look at this picture on the left, you can see Sarah is the furthest woman on the left. She married Philip Grohl, who's the furthest person on the left. dapper fellow, always was dressed nicely, seemed to be a nice fellow. Aunt Sarah was very kind. She was very pretty and very kind and classy lady. We saw her on a few visits because of Sarah. They lived in Pennsylvania, and there was not a lot of traveling back and forth. We got to see them very seldom. And the next child is the bride, who is Mary Elizabeth Greene. She went to James Madison University, what's now James Madison University, as did Sarah. She was a teacher in Waynesboro. I would take her to some of the reunions when she was quite elderly, and she was very popular and very exacting English teacher. The wedding occurs here in St. Louis in 1941. She married David Bell, who worked for Union Apple Company in Fishersville. They ended up purchasing an apple orchard there of about 80 acres, lived in a small cottage. As my mother always said, David was a gentleman farmer. They had no children. He was a nice guy. They farmed organically very, very early, had all stacks of organic gardening around, and were very proud of their garden, and they really sold vegetables and fruits and hogs. Uncle David raised hogs there, so that's how they made their living. In the back is Mary Highland Bell, who is David's sister, and then the other gentleman on the right is Dwight Hollingsworth. He married Aunt Helen, and he had made a surprise visit to the wedding in St. Louis. He was a wonderful guy. We'll talk more about him when we see a picture of Aunt Helen coming up here in just a second. The next picture is Frances Greene. I like the younger picture of her in the group to see that when she was young, because she was the eldest, and she was very kind when she lived at Bridgewater Home. She always took flowers, grew flowers in her yard, took them to people in the nursing home, cared for folks, did every volunteer act she could. She was, I guess, one of the original environmentalists, and quite a legend in our family with some of the things she did as an eccentric lady. And the next picture you'll see is of Mary. Mary was very pretty. She was the first freshman May Queen at James Madison University, and she was a real kind lady. The next picture is my father at his freshman year at Virginia Tech in his military uniform. And then this is an up-close picture of Helen, probably taken at Natural Bridge. And Helen and Uncle Holly would come and visit periodically, and she always had a twinkle in her eye, and she was a very pretty lady also, but really fun to be around and always laughing. And Holly was likewise the same. They were wonderful folks. For the short few times we saw them, they were really fun to be with. And the last picture is on the sofa at my home at Rose Hill Circle, and on the far left is Nimrod Trimble Greene, or my Uncle Nim. That's the only picture I have of him. He was a giant man. He was about 6'4". 6'5" and huge. He loved to hunt. He would come in a big Wilson truck that he'd rigged up the back of to be a hunting lodge and come to hunt in the area. And he was a carpenter. He was a soldier in World War II. Next seated to him is Frances Greene, whom we've spoken about, and then Mary Greene, and then Helen Greene. And then in the white shirt on the right is my father. He went to Virginia Tech. He came back and farmed what we call the Greene Farm there in Fairfield. Then he was drafted into the Army, served in World War II, went all the way to Japan, came home, worked for the Prudential Insurance Company, and had 3 kids. So Milton Greene, to go back, those are his children. And when you think about it, he was age 46 when his wife died, and he had he had 6 kids, ranging from Francis, who was 18 years old, down to Helen, who was 4 years old. And that's a pretty daunting task. I think it was at this time that he moved into Greeneville, into the home in Greeneville there. And he married, he had a second wife who was Ada Craig, who was supposed to be a wonderful lady, according to Becky Jo and Mary Jane, who met her when they were children. Ada had 2 children, so these would be stepbrothers of my father. They were J. Lucas Craig and Fred Craig, who I remember meeting them, and they were very nice. Milton and Ada did have a son. They called him Little Milton. It was Milton E. Greene Jr. He was supposed to be a nice little fellow, and unfortunately, when he was 11, he stepped on a nail, and he died of tetanus. So that brings us down in the Greene family history to the 6 kids that Milton had with Eliza. And pretty much people who get to read this will know those histories so much more than these.